Welcome to Glass of Bubbly. I'm Oliver Walkey and I'm here with Clarke, OBE, one of the most famous and loved wine experts, familiar on TV and a writer of over 30 books. Now we're here because you recently introduced a new book to the world, Clarke's Story of Wine. Can you tell us a little bit about what your readers can expect to discover and sort of what it inspired you to tell your story? Your version of the story of wine?
Yeah, because it is really my story. It's not the story. It's just the kind of story that I want to tell. And what it is about 100, 110 different little chunks of stories. And I really mean that because I think that wine often gets compartmentalized into being a liquid and being solely about what something tastes like, what the grapes are, how many barrels it had and for how long, blah, 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 blah. And to me, wine actually doesn't really exist without the story of the people who made it, the places that it comes from, the why and the wherefore. And this book is about simply everything I found interesting. There's lots of stuff missing in it. You know, you might say, oh, where's this, where's that? Well, the reason where's this, where's that, I found it boring. If I find it boring, it's not in. It might be quite important, but if it's boring, I just thought this is not about boring people to death. This is about enthusing people. And I just look at wine as a wonderful part of being alive and a wonderful part of the joys of life. This is one part of it, not the whole part of it. And so I want to talk about the triumphs of wine and the disasters of wine. They're both in there. So I talk about the heroes of wine and the villains of wine. They're both in there. I'm talking about the wonderful, wonderful leaps forward that worked and the leaps forward that didn't work. I'm talking about the fantastic mistakes that should never have happened, and they created entirely new sorts of wine. And I try to get the facts right whenever I can, but I'm a great believer in my mother's general view on life that don't let the facts get in the way of a good story now. So if there's look, often when you're looking back hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years, you've got facts. There's the dull ones and there's the interesting ones. Which ones are really correct? You think, well, I don't know. Nobody really knows which ones are correct. So I think I'll choose the racier ones down the bottom there and leave the duller ones at the top. So, because this book is about people sitting back with a smile on their face and saying, God, I didn't know that. And obviously it does, stuff about where wine comes from, so the Georgians and that kind of stuff. That's really interesting that people are still making wine out of these amazing earthenware jars. That they were doing it 8,000 years ago. I've been in Georgia. I was in Georgia a couple of years ago, and I went to this monastery because a lot of the best wines in Georgia are made by sort of bishops and people with enormous beards and things. I went to this monastery. There's a wonderful bishop there, and after he'd introduced me or welcomed me with a polyphonic choir, which made your head buzz with excitement, I then said, "Okay, let's see where you make your wine." And I went into the courtyard of the cathedral, and there were these ancient Kveveries, these ancient earthenware jars. And I said, God, how old are those? And he said, oh, from about the 1200s. I said, what are you going to do with them? He said, oh, we're just cleaning them out for next year's harvest. He was going to make next year's harvest in earthenware jars that were nearly 1,000 years old. It was wonderful. So those kind of stories are there. But also the myths, lots of really good myths about how wine started. And one or two of them might be true, so I choose the ones I like and shove them in there. And I do talk about where the great styles of wine come from. Where does Bordeaux come from? Why is Bordeaux important? Why is Burgundy important? How did Rioja start? What about Chianti? Port and Sherry and Madeira? How did they get going? What are they? But I also talk about Liebfraumilch. People say, some of the wine buffs who've been on at me about the book say, oh, why are you talking about White Zinfandel? Why are you talking about Liebfraumilch? Why are you talking about Mathieu's Rosé or Beaujolais Nouveau or Gallo's Hearty Burgundy? Who's interested in them? And I say, well, you might not be interested in them, but the vast majority of the people who just might want to buy a wine book, maybe for the first ever time, they probably think Liebfraumilch is quite interesting because that's what they grew up on. They probably think that Montana Sauvignon Blanc or Lindemann's Bin 65 Chardonnay or Penfolds Bin 28 Shiraz, they probably think that's pretty interesting. So I talk about it. And I talk about glass. Glass? What's so special about glass? Well, when wine was invented, there wasn't any glass. And when glass was invented, there weren't any decanters. And when decanters were invented, there weren't any bottles. When bottles were invented, there weren't any proper glasses, bit by bit. And of course, there weren't any labels probably until the 19th century. And so we talk about all of those things. Marketing. Wait, what? Marketing? Marketing's crucial. Let's put it in there. Brands, are they important? They certainly are. Most people drink brands. So, it goes. And I tell stuff about, I don't know, the Nazis. Hitler wanted to be the greatest wine collector in the world. So I tell the story about the Nazis' wines. I tell the story about the vintages in the First World War, which they call them the blood vintages, 1914, 1915, particularly. When the Battle of the Marne, the first and the second battles of the Marne in the First World War, they were absolutely in the middle of the Grand Cru vineyards, in the middle of Champagne. And somehow the women and children and the old men still went out there. Quite a few got killed. They kept looking after the vines. Over comes a shell. Down you go, lie on the floor. It missed it. Okay, we start again. Do a bit more proning. Oops, here comes another shell. Down on the floor. That one missed it. Oh, I think it got Gaston. Okay, Gaston's gone. We've got to keep going. And they call them blood vintages. They're still there. Prohibition. It's a wonderful story. It's madness. It's completely bonkers idea in America of prohibition. It's a great story. One might say, is it the story of wine? Well, I make it the story of wine. It's mostly really the story of hard liquor and gangsterism and the rise of the mafia and all these things. But you can shove wine in there. There's loads of lovely stuff about wine in Prohibition. And then you talk what happens nowadays. Are we going to go on using glass? Are we going to use cardboard? Are we going to use cans? How are we going to package wine? Packaging wine takes an awful lot of carbon emissions. If we stopped using big glass bottles, we could dramatically reduce our carbon emissions. So let's look at the alternatives. And talking of climate change, I talk about climate change quite a lot in the book because it's absolutely embedded now in the world of wine and how we appreciate the world of wine. So I do talk about biodynamism and natural wines and orange wines and all that kind of stuff. Everything that's happening in wine, what I'd like to think is everything interesting that happened in wine, I try to put in there. Everything interesting that's happening at the moment, I try to put in there. And I try to say, okay, what's going to happen in the next 20 years? So do a few predictions about stuff. And at the end of it, I'm in need of a drink.
When I read your book, I did find it very easy to read and very fun. It's just, as you were just saying, the plain facts and the myths, the exciting stuff of world wine, because it can be very, very overly complicated by sometimes. So it leads me on to my next question. That for myself, one of the most fascinating things for me is exploring Champagne and wine during World War II. And in your book, I read that a lot of the stolen bottles of wine during the occupation were ultimately returned to the rightful owners. I'm curious as to what era in the history fascinates you the most in the history of wine. What era fascinates you the most?
I think the current era is exciting because we really are having to change the way we look at wine because nature's not letting us do otherwise. If we don't really react in Burgundy, in Bordeaux, in Rioja, in Chianti, in Champagne, in England, if we don't react for better or for worse, we're going to really suffer as wine lovers in the next 10 or 20 years. I think that the whole era of the 20s and 30s and 40s is interesting, and I take your point about Champagne in the Second World War, the amount of champagne that was stolen, looted, because Goering said, I mean to loot and loot magnificently. And Hitler said, take everything, give nothing back. Those were the two guys who just said, just take everything that France has got. We want a lot. One or two other people saying, hang on, this war's going to end sometime. Shouldn't you be a bit more careful about this? those two said, no, we're having the lot. And the possibly the most famous champagne in the first 50 years of the last century was 1928 Salon. And when Bernard de Nonancourt, who was the great guy, one of the great champagne grandees by the time he died, which is really only about last year, when he was the young French officer who led the way up to Hitler's eagle's nest, where he had, I don't know, 1 million bottles or something like that of the greatest wines of France there. And Bernard de Nonancourt was given the jimmy to pull open the door, the crowbar, to get into the door of that cellar. He opened the door of that cellar. As the sunlight finally went into the cellar, it fell on case after case after case after case of Salon 1928, the greatest wine made in Champagne in 50 years. There it was. So, and I hope that de Nonancourt said, fellas, we're in, here we are, it's cold, open it. I hope they sprayed it down their throats for a few hours, and then the rest was taken back to France and managed to be one of the great classic wines of the last, one of the great classic wines of the 20th century in Champagne. But I think in terms of excitement, I'm not sure that the 19th century, the one when the Industrial Revolution made an enormous difference, the one when science began to play an enormous part, the one when people began to understand fermentation, they began to understand microbial, bacterial defects. They began to, the Burgundians had known about what makes a vineyard special forever, but most people hadn't. In the 19th century, they began to work it out much, much better, the kind of places that you could make something special. The oak barrel really only began to be spread around the world after, late 19th century. The Bordeaux people had it for a long time, and they'd kept it to themselves. And then the great phylloxera louse, and you know all about the phylloxera, and you know all about the phylloxera body. Yes, I don't know what to tell you. Anyway, there's stories about it in the book. But when that came and devastated the world of wine, again, it was like climate change magnified. It was a massive challenge to wine. And one of the things it did, while Bordeaux flopped about with all its vineyards destroyed, was meant that all the Bordeaux people went down to Rioja. They got phylloxera in Bordeaux end of the 1860s, didn't get to phylloxera till the beginning of the next century. So they had 30 or 40 years when they didn't. It was an area, only 2 or 3 hours drive. Well, they had trains, 2 or 3 hours train ride from Bordeaux in the bottom end of France, right down there at the bottom of the Bare Biscay, and you go down to the Bare Biscay and turn along like that, and there's sort of something like Bilbao. You're only a few hours drive away, and just over the mountains there is Rioja. It's the closest place which the people in Bordeaux discovered could make wine still, which hadn't been killed by the phylloxera louse. So what they did, they took not only how to make wine down there, but they took all these barrels, and the Bordeaux barrel, the Barrique Bordelaise, this amazing 225 litre barrel, which one says, why is it 225 litres? All around the world, the barrel is 225 litres. The story is that that's the size that one pretty hefty bloke can lift by himself. It's possibly that. It's entirely likely that that's about the level of bend that a cooper, for instance, could use fire. So a barrel, maybe that amount of wood you could bend without it cracking. So those are the kind of reasons that the wonderful happenstance, the serendip of wine. Why is it that everyone around the world uses a 225 litre barrel? It's something to do with a big, heavy bloke who can lift it, or a cooper, or the kind of wood that you have near Bordeaux, where you can just bend it so much before it cracks, all these things. Anyway, nobody was using the barrel, the new barrel like that, until the Bordeaux people took it down to Rioja, taught them how to use the barrel, and then of course 40 years later Bordeaux recovered, so all the Bordeaux people went back to Bordeaux. They left the barrel idea in Rioja, and bit by bit it spread, and then of course the idea of the barrel spread enormously 100 years later, when you got California, Australia, then later South Africa, Chile, and then later Argentina, New Zealand, those kind of people. And then about the same time, Northern Italy, all saying, how on earth do we challenge Bordeaux's traditional kingship of total domination of the world of fine wine? And they started saying, well, we can choose the grape varieties. You can't take the soil away from Bordeaux. It's very interesting soil in Bordeaux. There are two main types: the gravelly type, which is great for Cabernet Sauvignon, and the limestone and clay type, which is great for the Merlot grape. And people all around the world have been trying to replicate them, and nobody really has managed to make a wine quite like a great Pauillac or a Saint-Julien from Cabernet, or quite like a great Pomerol or Saint-Emilion from the other side, from Merlot. But they've done their best, and the way you can do it is get the grape varieties. So you take Cabernet Sauvignon, you take Merlot, then eventually you take Cabernet Franc, and if you make a few mistakes and get it all completely wrong, you end up with Carmenère, and you might end up with Malbec, and you think it comes from France, and it may do, but it may well not. But you call it Malbec because why wouldn't you? The other thing you can take is this idea they use new oak barrels to age their wine. Even 50, 60 years ago, that was a pretty unusual idea. The Californians started doing it in, not really before the 1950s, 1960s, a tiny bit, and it really wasn't before the 1980s that the Californians really took it seriously. Same with the Australians. The idea of new oak barrel aging really didn't get going till about the 1980s. That's only 40 years ago. Nowadays one thinks new oak barrel aged Chardonnays and Cabernets and Pinot Noirs, that's the most normal thing in the world. It wasn't 40 years ago. 40, that's within living memory. A new oak barrel aged wine made with French oak. That was an important thing as well, because of course the Bordeaux area is near Limousin. The Limousin forests are wonderful oak forests, and France is a brilliant place for oak. France, to be honest, this is a theme that weaves backwards and forwards through the book. France is just a brilliant place for the culture of eating and drinking. It's just in the right place. It's got Mediterranean on one side, and it's got the English Channel on the other side. And between those two, in terms of latitude, just about every possible condition that you could want to raise great food and raise great drink is available. It's really lucky. Some people, a lot of people say, oh, Italy is better than France. Some people say Spain is. Some people say Germany is. I just say they're all great, those other places. None of them have the natural advantages of France in terms of where it is on the map. And the other thing is that none of them have the natural trading advantages, because look at France, it's got the Mediterranean down there. Just go across there, you've got the Bay of Biscay heading out to the world. You then go around Normandy, and you've got the north of France looking out at the whole of Northern Europe. France is in a better place to trade wine than any other country in the world. And trade and export is the way that you make your wine famous. There's no point sitting in a little village in the middle of Italy saying, we made the best wine in the world. No one knows about it. Why don't we know about it? Oh, it's too far to the coast, and the donkey fell ill, and we couldn't get the barrel down, and we missed the boat and all that. Bordeaux, being on one of the great natural harbours of the world, the Gironde estuary goes down there. It's the biggest natural harbour in the whole of Western Europe. And it's basically down there that all the ships, hundreds and hundreds of ships, used to turn up in Bordeaux, fill themselves with barrels and head off, not only to England and Ireland and Scotland, but also to Belgium and Holland, whatever they were called in those days, and northern Germany, and Denmark, and Norway, and Sweden, and Russia. The whole of that area, the Baltic, the whole of Northern Europe, and of course they were the great maritime nations. The Dutch were a great maritime nation. The English were a great maritime nation. They were the ones going off and saying, hey, where's the rest of this world? Where is it? They found America. They found South America. They went round to the Indies. They went across to places like Australia, Southern Africa. And every single time, if they were actually trying to say, hey, we need to take some decent wine with us, they took two. They took port, rich port from Portugal, because it would last forever and you could do what you like with it. And honestly, you'd still get the stuff to, I don't know, Melbourne or any kind of other place, thousands of miles away over the equator in decent nick. But if you were going to take any sort of table wine, the only table wine that had traditionally proven its ability to age was Bordeaux. And so Bordeaux became the template for fine wine all around the world. The template for white wine, interestingly enough, became white Burgundy. You sort of think, what's wrong with white Bordeaux? And frankly, there's nothing wrong with white Bordeaux, basically, except it was just appallingly badly made. And in Burgundy, there were enough people who realized the Chardonnay grape on those limestoney soils of Burgundy, which are sort of eastish facing. They're not even south facing. And this is another fascinating thing that every time you research books, you discover more. That the great Chardonnay vineyards in Europe are often east facing rather than south facing. Indeed, in Champagne, the Côte de Blanc vineyards of Champagne, they're east-northeast facing. You think, but Champagne's the coldest part of France. You must want more sun, have more sun. No, you don't need more sun to make wonderful grapes. And in fact, one of the things that they say about the gentle sunshine, you get, after east-northeast, you'll get all that morning sunshine. You just won't get it quite so direct. You'll get morning sunshine. So that'll stop things like frosts destroying your vineyards if you could possibly help it. You won't get the heat of the afternoon sun, but the experts tell me that the photosynthesis that you get from the morning sun is more effective than the photosynthesis that you get from the warmer afternoon sun. So if you want delicate, beautifully fragrant, balanced grapes full of subtlety and joy, if you get the photosynthesis, but the conditions are cooler, you'll keep your acid up, you'll keep your freshness up, and you'll actually end up with probably more sugar in your grapes than stuff which is facing west and getting more heat, but less photosynthesis. Oh, that was a technical moment. I don't know many of those. Stop encouraging me.
I'm so sorry. I want to go back to Georgia. I know we touched upon it earlier, but at this point in time, Georgia is believed to be the birthplace of wine, dating back to 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, and it is always a popular debate subject. I just wanted to get your take on where you stood on Georgia being the birthplace of wine.
I think it's the birthplace of wine as far as we know. It's the whole of eastern Anatolia, the Trans-Caucasus area there, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, northeastern Turkey. Those are the areas which so far we have found more archaeological presence of winemaking possibilities than anywhere else. The one reason why Georgia is my favourite and everybody's favourite is because they're still doing it. Now, if you go into Azerbaijan or Armenia, you might say, "Hey, where's your 8,000-year-old winemaking kit?" And they'd say, "Oh, got rid of that ages ago." But in Georgia, they're still doing it. If you go out into the villages in Georgia, it's thrilling, because not only are they still making wine in these kvevari, not everybody does it, but lots of people do, these old earthenware jars, but they do this sort of thing of saying, we shove everything in there and we put a great big stopper on the top of the pot and cover it with earth, and off we go. And it's his birthday in 9 months' time. Oh, we'll open this one. But what's it going to be like? Well, that's right, it could be great. And if it tastes a bit different from last year's, why wouldn't it? Different grapes. And it's really the big companies obviously will check stuff, but the smaller people, they finally say, okay, it's Dimitri's birthday, and this is your kebab. Out you get, in goes the ladle, swirl it around, say, what have we got? And that's the first time they see it, and the flavors are very different from real wine, but the texture is the most important thing, because these wines are mostly made from white grapes, not black grapes, and yet the colour is a wonderful amber. Now, they called it orange, but the Georgians prefer to call it amber. It's a sort of halfway to amber to orange to burnished gold. It depends really what grapes, what the condition of the grapes and the stalks were when they shoved them in. Hey, it's all in there. Stalks, grapes, all the mush, it goes in there. And I just think that the wine that we can get from Georgia is so fundamentally different in flavour and aroma and texture to any other sort of wine that we have in the modern world that I am delighted to give the palm to Georgia and saying, you started it all. But whether they actually did, well, this is another of those things. People will go on finding bits and pieces of winemaking evidence for years yet, and I'm sure there will be stuff older than Georgia which is found. And after all, you can go and look at the legends, the legend of King Jamshid and all these people, where I don't know when he was going, but thousands and thousands of years ago, and the idea that he used to like eating grapes, and he was a king of ancient Persia, and one of the grapes seemed to be sour, one of the jars, so he shoved it to one side and marked it as poison. And one of the members of his harem was having a rough old time. She said, I'm going to end it all. That's marked poison. So she went and gorged herself on these, I would have thought, pretty disgusting grapes if they were basically fermenting, or more likely they'd finished fermenting. And it's just possible that, of course, that if he wanted to eat grapes right the way through the year, they might have raisined them out on mats, then shoved them in the jar. Normally they wouldn't ferment, but one jar obviously did ferment. That's why they thought there's something wrong with this, shoved it as poison. And this poor old person from the harem said, this'll end it all. And of course, they say she woke up the next morning refreshed and full of life. And you think, if you were the first person to gorge yourself on wine, you would wake up with a skull splitter. You wouldn't wake up feeling refreshed and joyful. And then, of course, you'd say, and that wasn't me, was it, which ripped all my kit off? And it wasn't me dancing around the kitchen table, was it? And it wasn't me singing those football songs. Oh no, it wasn't me, was it? I better go back to the jar and get started all over again. Of course, it might have happened like that. Why not? Happenstance, serendipity, that's what so much of life is about. And when it comes to chance things in food and in drink, it's often chance. It's entirely possible. It's entirely probable that some of the jars of preserved grapes fermented. Now, they might have been thrown away because fermentation would smell disgusting. It's a sour, acrid kind of smell when things start to ferment. If you're not used to it, they might have thrown them away. But the time's going to come when they don't throw them away. Time's going to come when someone's going to try them. Life's like that. Was it them? Was it the Georgians? Was it the Chinese? Was it the people that out on the steppes in the middle of Asia? I don't know. But I'll go with the Georgians. The story's better.
What is the oldest wine that you've ever tasted?
Oh God. It was from the 18th century. What was it? 1787 Terrantes, something like that. The only place you can really get 18th century wine on a remotely regular basis is Madeira. And even then, I mean, there's not much of it left, but you can, 19th century, if you know Madeira shippers and friendly with them, they've all got loads of 19th century wine, and it's all in absolute ace nick. The 1787 Terrantes, it's one of those, I was one of these lucky moments when someone says, do you want to come to a Madeira tasting? And instead of saying, oh, I'm sorry, I've got to check my sock drawer, you think, oh, well, why not? You got this Madeira tasting, and it's not just the last 10 years, it's the last 250 years they put out in front of you. You think, Jesus, okay, get down to it. And I made copious notes right back to, I think, the 1792. And I've lost the notes for 1787. I can't believe it. The oldest wine I've ever tasted in my life, I lose the notes.
That is a great shame.
Wouldn't have made much sense, but I'd like to have had them.
Yes, it has been a great pleasure to speak with you on Glass of Bubbly, and I've just got one final thing to ask you, if you don't mind. Would you mind signing my copy of your book?
Certainly. It's been good. It's good fun to write a book like this. When you're writing well, writing's great fun. When you're not writing well, it's bloody miserable. And you can't, day after day, you think, I can't get it. I can't get it. What I do eventually, I go running and I go walking and all these things, and you eventually think, okay, enough's enough. Sheet of A4 paper, write. It's amazing how often you just say, write. You can.
It starts flowing out.
And I said, doesn't matter what you write about. I've got no ideas. Doesn't matter. Write. Hello, my name is Oz, blah, 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 blah. 6 or 7 lines later, you think, well, that's not bad. And then suddenly you've written a page and you've started again. So, you see what happens? All right, you start me off. Weren't you given the mask and the gag when I came on? They said, here's the mask, here's the gag. If you can't stop him, just put the gag on him.
I was not, unfortunately, no. We'll have to do that next time.
Do it next time.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for watching.